This is Miller Philosopher. In one of my videos on the Vanyar elves, a particular mini debate kept popping up in the comments section. Who was the stronger of the Eldar, the Noldor or the Vanyar? And there were supporters for either side. And recently that question intrigued me, so I thought I'd take a look. On the surface, the points are rather obvious. The Noldor were the more numerous, creative, and physically active of the Eldar, with a height being around 7 foot. Is there a Valinor basketball team by chance? The Vanyar, though, were the wiser and more noble of the Eldar, being essentially artists, singers, and lore masters under the direct tutelage of the Valar. Noldor supporters generally regard the Noldor as flawed, but still more proactive and essentially not being Valar simps, having shaped the history of Middle-earth and helped keep it safe from not entirely falling under the sway of Morgoth by keeping him focused in Beleriand before their final fall. While the Vanyar supporters like to point out how easily susceptible to corruption the Noldor were, and how the Vanyar were the wiser of the two when it came to the deceptions of Melkor, and not deceived, even those that married into the Noldor clan, and that it was a Vanyar majority army that comprised the army of the West that finally liberated Middle-earth and defeated Morgoth, whereas the Noldor had not during their entire stay in Middle-earth. So to answer this question, I decided that I first start out with looking at how Tolkien himself defined power, since he was the author. Letter 144 that was written in 1954. The story is cast in terms of a good side and a bad side, beauty against ruthless ugliness, tyranny against kingship, moderated freedom with consent against compulsion that has long lost any object save mere power, and so on. But both sides, in some degree, conservative or destructive, want a measure of control. But if you have, as it were, taken a vow of poverty, renounce control and take your delight in things for themselves without reference to yourself, watching, observing, and to some extent knowing, then the question of the rights and wrongs of power and control might become utterly meaningless to you, and the means of power quite valueless. So, in other words, we're talking about two separate things here. He apparently seemed to regard power as the ability to assert one's control over something or someone else, and that apparently everyone wanted some level of this to some degree or another, to shape and make things as they will it. However, Tolkien also regards the vow of poverty from power as the higher ideal, so that whether or not power was good or evil or stronger or weaker literally didn't matter. That being said, for this particular topic, we're going to be examining this from the less idealistic perspective, or, as Dragon Ball fans like to call it, power scaling. And when it comes to this perspective, I have to give it to the Noldor, and this is why. The Vanyar are considered the wisest and fairest of the elves. They are the closest to the ruling Valar power couple, Manwë and Varda. They reject Morgoth and a Noldor rebellion, and liberate Middle-earth from Morgoth. Yes, all true. Equally, Tolkien doesn't seem to name them in terms of feats and accolades as he does Noldor, or, in other words, in terms of power scaling when it comes to Middle-earth activities and whatnot. The ability to assert and maintain control over matter and make of it what you will. Specifically, the elf named to be the most gifted and strongest in these areas is Fëanor, who is the most Noldor of the Noldor, the Ultra Noldor, to the point where he almost despises the Vanyar side of his family and not regarded them as true Noldor at all. Fëanor created the Silmarils that held the remaining light of the old world, and it's thanks to him that the light even exists after Morgoth and Ungoliant killed the two trees. Fëanor led the first Eldar invasion to Middle-earth to almost the doors of Thangorodrim itself, and took on multiple Balrogs and stood toe-to-toe with them until the strongest of their number arrived. In comparison, No Vanyar elf by name has such acolytes attached to them, though they were still free of evil. The Noldor are also noted as being the greatest warriors in Beleriand during the First Age, and before that were noted to be more physically active and more ambitious, being the first in Valinor to craft weapons of war, such as swords, shields, arrows, and developing cavalry. And while it's true that the longer they remained in Middle-earth, the more that Eldar power within them diminished, none of that took away from their battlefield prowess or their particular heroism in spite of their bloody and egotistical flaws. And this particular trait lasts all the way up until the Third Age, with the Noldor being noted as, while no longer being the greatest warriors of Middle-earth, are still noted as being extremely formidable and not to be taken lightly. The Vanyar were not noted as warriors, but as artisans. They had no ambition save to remain in the presence of the powers, even at the cost of forsaking the other Eldar tribes and Middle-earth itself, only returning because they were ordered to by those powers. And speaking of which, when it comes to the second Eldar invasion during the War of Wrath, the army of the West more or less did just as well against Morgoth's armies as the Noldor had, objectively speaking. Now you can argue that this version of Morgoth's army was better equipped, more numerous, and more powerful than the one the Noldor encountered. But I would counter that so too were the Vanyar. Both sides had Maiar at their backs, and the army of the West being in fact led by a Maiar who in the published Silmarillion is said to be the greatest weaponsmith of all time. I think this nullifies any advantage that the Balrogs may have had. Now, had the Noldor showed up with this same advantage at their back, I think they would have done just as well continually against the orcs early on. And especially more so probably because this was before dragons were even created. This preference is even shown in the choice of weapons of the Vanyar, choosing to use spears instead of the up-close and personal weapons of swords and shields as the Noldor did. Though, you can also argue that this may have been tactically wiser and would more or less make some sense since they are the wiser of the two. Regarding dragons though, the only reason that the Valinorian army didn't just solo Morgoth's armies outright was because of the dragons led by my boy Caligan the Black, whom was only defeated by neither the Maiar, nor the Vanyar, nor the Noldor among them, nor the men who fought with them, but by an army of great eagles led by one Cimmeral-powered Erendil. Essentially, that the Vanyar's successes lay more in the fact that they still had the holy power grafted to their being, and that empowered them from the Holy Land rather than any particular battlefield prowess, as well as having again Maiar at their back, as well as an army of great eagles and a Cimmeral-powered human. It's essentially like shining a flashlight into your enemy's eyes and then beating the hell out of them while they're blinded. And this is something that both the Vanyar and the Noldor had when they both arrived in Middle-earth, just that the Noldor steadily lost it the longer they stayed. Now again, this does depend on which perspective you are approaching power from, and I feel that many Tolkien fans approaching this will take the moralist perspective, in which I've already said the Vanyar are the greatest. However, they're not perfect either, and the Noldor I think can somewhat contest them here as well. Recall that the original purpose of all the elves, as well as the Valar, was to teach humanity. However, the Eldar as a whole were taught rather to forsake that land that humanity inhabited, and that being the case, the Vanyar were more or less sharing the guilt of the Valar as well. Specifically that none of them, nor any of the Maiar forces, nor for that matter honestly none of the Noldor forces that came with them, if I'm being honest, stayed to help Beleriand recover from the war, nor, as far as we can determine at least, help survivors migrate east over the Blue Mountains in order to escape the incoming sea. That last part may have happened, but again, I haven't been able to find any record of it. They did liberate Middle-earth, but only to leave it in a worse state than it was before. It would be like if the Allies invaded Europe in 1944, liberated the continent from Nazi Germany, and then just decided to pick up and leave with all their gears, manpower, and whatnot, without any kind of plans for how the Europeans were supposed to recover from 6 years of devastating war. Now, can it be argued that the longer the Vanyar stayed, the more likely they will become like the Noldor who rebelled, lesser in power and stature? Yes. Was Beleriand a lost cause by this point? Yeah, probably was. And I did theorize before how I believed that the Teleri Eldar that had sailed the army to Middle-earth didn't step foot on it again because they could see and feel that massive change. All of these may be true, yet it remains that the Noldor and Sindar that did remain tried to heal what was left of their world, while also peacefully interacting with the other races as they were meant to, going into the Second Age and the Third Age. The Vanyar didn't do this, and from what I can tell, nor did they care to. Is that true wisdom? You tell me. That being said, these are my reasonings into why I believe the debate over who was the strongest of the Eldar overall goes to the Noldor. That being said, if you happen to disagree, let me know in the comments below. But this is the Miller Philosopher, and have a good day.